Okay, and now we are streaming live on Facebook, and we'll just get started in another minute or two. All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started now. I am very honored and very happy to be able to welcome a very special guest who will be speaking to the members of the Bayit, as well as whoever else is watching on Facebook. It is a special honor to welcome Dr. Jaques Gauthier, international legal expert. Dr. Gauthier's specialty, and as a matter of fact, I have his book on this very topic that he kindly presented me with. I've had to go to the gym to learn how to lift weights in order to be able to even hold this book. Dr. Gauthier's doctoral thesis is on sovereignty over the old city of Jerusalem. And it is, as you can imagine, a very carefully documented and researched work. Tonight, Dr. Gauthier will be addressing us and talking about the legitimacy of Israel's sovereignty claims under international law relating to Jerusalem and the disputed territories. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Gauthier's biography. Dr. Jaques Gauthier is a Canadian international lawyer and scholar. He received his PhD from the University of Geneva with a dissertation entitled, as I just showed you, Sovereignty over the Old City of Jerusalem. Dr. Gauthier's international practice has focused on numerous human rights issues. He is the founder of the Toronto law firm Gauthier and Associates, which was established in 1984. He has served as legal counsel to different governments, including the governments of France, Spain, Mexico, and Canada. In 2000, he was knighted by the President of France as Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite. In 2015, he was again knighted by the President of the Republic of France as he was appointed Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. Dr. Gauthier has presented his finding on the sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem and the disputed territories in many international centers, including the House of Commons in London, the US Congress in Washington, the Italian Senate in Rome, the United Nations in New York, the European Union Parliament in Brussels, the Japanese Parliament in Tokyo, the Canadian House of Commons in Ottawa, and the Dutch Parliament in The Hague. His work has also been presented in conference in Jerusalem, Basel, Geneva, San Remo, and Toronto. It is a special honor to welcome as our guest to the Bayit Conversations, Dr. Jaques Gauthier. Dr. Gauthier, you are unmuted. And so, first of all, I'd just like to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, let's get to know you for a moment. You're from Canada, I surmise. Tell us where you're from and where in the world you got interested, or how in the world you became interested in this particular subject, and why it has been a passion of yours for these past several decades. Please.
Well, first of all, Rabbi, I want to thank you for inviting me to make this presentation, to be part of this interview. I've been looking forward. We met many months ago, and then there were some delays because of the circumstances that we're all facing. But at last, we have an opportunity to do this, and it's a privilege, an honor. I'm delighted. I was born in Montreal a number of decades ago, and lived in Paris, France, almost for the first 10 years of my life. I was there from the age of 2. And that's part of the story. I was exposed to a number of European countries. My education, therefore, started in France. Then university in Canada, law school in Canada, and postgraduate studies in Geneva, Switzerland. And it's in that city in Geneva, which is in many ways linked to the work that I'm doing and I've been doing for so long, and that I studied international law. In the 70s, I spent 2 years studying the fundamentals of international law. I had some amazing professors, some of the leading professors in the world. This was at the Graduate Institute of International Studies. And it gave me certainly a thirst for not only international law, but international human rights. I did not complete my thesis at the end of the 2 years because I wanted to practice law and I had to come back to Canada to do that. And because my final exams went very well in Geneva and some of the professors wanted me to stay and to do a thesis, we kept in touch. And ultimately, with my wife, Rani, reminding me of the importance of doing the thesis, I started to work on it. Then I had to find a subject that was that would inspire me, that I would be passionate about. And when I look at my decision to focus on Jerusalem, to focus on the status of Jerusalem, I believe it's an amalgamation, a blend of my interest in history, human rights, my interest in international law, of course, but also my interest in the Middle East and in particular, Israel, the land of Israel, and the city of Jerusalem.
I guess I should clarify before you go any further that you did not come into this subject with any particular bias. You're not a member of our tribe, I understand. And so
I have not taken any tests. So I realize that I could confirm this, but to the best of my knowledge, I am not a member of any of the tribes that are associated with the land of Israel. However, if you take an x-ray of my heart, Rabbi, you will see that I have a deep love, not only for the land, but for the people. And it's a love which I can't explain other than the fact that I've been exposed to so much. When I talked about human rights, you should know that I spent many years pursuing different issues. I was for a while the chair, the president of one of Canada's leading human rights organization called Rights and Democracy, and I led a mission to China and interacted for an entire week with the Central Party of China. My concern at the time was the issues of having only one child in the family, and I was an advocate for a different approach. And but that was my focus. I established in Canada, in Ontario, an organization called Justice for Children, and which is quite active still. And I focused on the rights of francophones. There were numerous things that preoccupied me, but I was absolutely astonished when I started to focus on the history of the Jewish people, on the way the nations have treated the Jewish people, and in the past and in the present, the extent to which the nations have applied different standards when it comes to the Jewish people. And I can't understand how, when you present the facts, those who are part of the audience or those who listen to my arguments don't see the truth. And there's sort of a willingness to accept any narrative which is detrimental to the cause of the Jewish people, detrimental to the cause of Israel. And that situation has not only concerned me, but fascinated me. I wanted to understand why that was the case. So I started to focus on Jerusalem, and it became clear to me that from a legal perspective, there was a lot of connection between the false narratives and the failure to know the facts, the historical facts which supported the entitlements of the Jewish people, the state of Israel. So that became my focus, trying to understand the facts. At the outset, I was looking for an answer to a simple question. Has any party been given title, sovereignty in respect to the Holy Land, in respect to what was called Palestine at a certain point in time, in respect to the territory that's covered by the state of Israel right now, or the disputed territory? Has anybody, any nation, any party been given title? I didn't know the answer. After 20 years and putting together the thesis that you displayed a moment ago, I came to my conclusions. And the conclusion is that yes, title has been given. It's been given to the Jewish people in respect to Jerusalem. In fact, it's been given to the Jewish people in the state of Israel in respect to the entire area, which was Palestine west of the Jordan River.
Now,
So that's what my work is.
If I could just jump in for a second. I remember you telling me over coffee that when you were embarked on this thesis, your supervisor, your professor, was actually quite irritated with the conclusions that you were coming to because he was more of an advocate of the other side. Would you like to reflect on that?
Well, it's a very important part of the evolution of my work and my story. At the Graduate Institute, I had the privilege of getting to know Professor Marcelo Cohen, that's with the K, originally from Argentina, a brilliant professor of international law, who had published a thesis. I brought it along. And this thesis, which is written in French, has to do with adverse possession and sovereignty. His thesis won the Paul Guggenheim Prize when it was initially published because of its quality. Now, Professor Cohen rapidly came to the conclusion that his positions in respect to the claims of Israel and my positions were distinct. He didn't agree with the direction I was going into, so he challenged me. He said, listen, if you want to be one of my students, if I'm going to be the director of your thesis, you have to agree to this principle. You must defend absolutely every assertion, every statement that you make. This has to be a scientific document. And if you agree with these principles, we'll work together. And what I admired about Professor Cohen is that we weren't on the same page in respect to many aspects of these issues. But he said, if you are prepared to be a scientist and you go through the trouble of supporting everything that you allege, then we can work together. It's because of him that it took 20 years. It's because of him that I ended up with 1,300 pages and 3,200 footnotes. I can tell you that in those days, I often felt rather resentful that he was being so demanding. I almost quit a couple of times, but in the end, I am thankful because as a result, there's a solid document, which is now regarded around the world as probably the most comprehensive document on the issues that I've referred to. So
before,
that's the story.
I know that you have a presentation that you're going to be giving us to give us a little bit of a historical perspective on the sovereignty of the land of Israel according to international law. Before you do that, could you please tell us, has this presentation, which governmental or international bodies have actually accepted this narrative and this legal argument as the correct portrayal of international law? In other words, what I mean to ask is, has your legal argument, has it borne any fruit in being able to sway not only international opinion, but the international courts themselves?
Well, the short answer is, to some extent, it's had an impact, but I don't believe that any nation except one has changed its course or its disposition because of my work. Just to give you an example, I was asked to present my arguments in front of the parliament in Brussels, the European Parliament, and there were 200 MPs who listened very carefully, attentively, and I was told that I would be interrupted, that there would be a number of people who would oppose what I was doing. No one did. And at the end, there was a lineup of people who wanted to talk to me. I believe the facts that I present are irrefutable. No one can find arguments to contradict the facts that I present. And in the end, my conclusions are completely well-founded. Same thing happened in places like the Senate in Italy and the House of Commons in England. People listen and tend not to interrupt because I present the facts, as I will in a few moments. And I wish, again, that after all these presentations today, there would be a number of nations that are taking the position that Israel's foundations are solid and it has the right not only to be everywhere in Jerusalem, but everywhere in the disputed territory from an international law point of view. You have to remember that when I present this, I am not saying that because I have conclusions that are very, very solid in international law, that's the end of the problem, because I believe it's the beginning of a solution. When you stop calling Jewish people in any part of Jerusalem or any part of Judea and Samaria, you stop calling them usurpers and trespassers and thieves. If you stop that and say, no, they're there as of right, then perhaps the discussion can go on and be meaningful and lead to something good. But the nations take a different approach, taking the position, for instance, that Israel has no right to be in what they refer to as Eastern Jerusalem, which includes the entirety of the old city. So back to the nations, back to your question, Rabbi. Certainly the United States, through different meetings that I've had, individuals that I've worked with or in the government, has taken note and incorporated a number of the arguments in the positions they took recently in regard to the peace plan, in regard to willingness to recognize the annexation of some components of the disputed territories. I can't go into details, but it's been taken into consideration. The one government that's finally taken positions that reflect an understanding of what I've been arguing is the government of Israel. Can you imagine? I've been making presentations around the world since 2007. And when I first went to meet with people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Justice, the leaders, those who were taking care of Israel's interaction worldwide, their initial response to me was, well, Dr. Gauthier, we're aware of your work. It's marvelous work, but it's too late. Things are carved in stone now in the minds of most nations that Israel is indeed a thief and that it's the Palestinian lands that they're occupying. And I think we're too late. And in those days, my response was immediately, it's never too late for the truth. Darkness is dispelled by light. Truth dispels untruth. And it's a huge mistake not to continually present the true narrative relating to the rights of the Jewish people in Israel, which I will present to you in a few moments. Can you believe that over the last couple of years, there have been 2 conferences organized in Jerusalem by several departments of the government, including Ministry of Justice, Foreign Affairs, Strategic Affairs, conferences to present my work. These arguments, the San Remo conference, which was unknown to most people, most Jewish people for so long, now is referred to continually by different, not only legal experts, but the government of Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel had a special presentation or a special statement on the anniversary of the conference, April 25, when I was supposed to be organizing a conference in San Remo. So there's progress.
I don't want to cut into your time. That you do have, Dr. Gauthier has about a 30-minute presentation on PowerPoint. We're going to open up his screen in just a moment. And I do want to leave us time for questions at the end. So I'd like to ask you, Dr. Gauthier, if you wouldn't mind, to begin the legal argument that you present. I know it's a lot of information to compact in such a small amount of time. This is probably one of the most difficult things to do, which is to compress all of that data into such a small amount of time. But you've done it before, and I'm sure you'll do an able job now. So please, if you will, if you bring up your screen, please.
Okay, so I will start by a number of comments before we go into some of the details. The reason, I think I may have referred to it, so many are able to present a narrative, which in my view is a false narrative, it's not well-founded, is because there are so many relevant historical facts. So much has happened pertaining to the question of sovereignty over Jerusalem and the disputed territories, that when you don't know the facts, it's easy to present conclusions that are not well-founded. So the biggest challenge for me was to put the puzzle together. And if you ever do a puzzle, if you don't want to have the key pieces, it's hard to put it together. And there are very significant events that are outlined on your screen right now that you need to be aware of, you need to understand in order to get to the right conclusion as to who's got sovereignty over these territories. And you'll see that in the middle of my chart here is the San Remo Conference of 1920. So it's so daunting when you think of it. I have to squeeze my 1,300 pages in a 30-minute presentation. I'm going to try to do that, and along the way, I'm going to stress the importance of particular historical events. So we'll get started with the Balfour Declaration. It was in 1917 that the Balfour Declaration was issued or was made public by not a man by the name of Balfour, but
I think Dr. Gauthier has become frozen. Dr. Gauthier, we're no longer able to hear you. I think your computer is frozen, sir. Is anyone able to hear Dr. Gauthier? I think we may have lost Dr. Gauthier, and he'll probably come back on in just a moment. While we're waiting for him to come back on, as I mentioned, it is such a daunting task because there are so many pivotal events in the history of the modern state of Israel. And it really boils down to, just like in any real estate deal, who holds title to the land according to international law. And in order for this to really be a legitimate kind of legal claim, it needs to be demonstrated that the international community actually awarded the title of the land that is now called Israel to the Jewish people. And as Dr. Gauthier will demonstrate, this was done in the San Remo Conference in the 1920s. And this is really the basis of his entire argument, is that we can look at the Balfour Declaration, we can look at the Partition Plan of 1947, but the most important document which actually awards the state of Israel and the Jewish people sovereignty and legal rights of title over the land of Israel is the San Remo Conference and what happened during that time. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get Dr. Gauthier back on the line. I'm just going to give him a call and see if everything's okay. Just give me a moment, please. Yes, hi, we seem to have lost you. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, you were just starting on the discussion of the Balfour Declaration. Do you want me to hang on the line while you're doing that, or should I hang? We're sorry to everyone listening about this technical difficulty. Dr. Gauthier will be back on the line in just a moment. And he is back. And you just need to unmute yourself, Dr. There you are. Okay.
Okay. Well, I must have been saying something really important, because there's always opposition when you try to present light and truth. You can hear me now. So let me go back to the Balfour Declaration. And apologize that there was an interruption. You have to enable the screen sharing, Rabbi?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Let me make you the co-host again.
Yes.
There you go. And we thank Adriella, your daughter, for help for doing the assist on the screen production. There we are.
Okay. Hopefully, we will not be dealing with any more technical issues, but back to the Balfour Declaration, which I think is where we were. What was important about the Balfour Declaration is that it was a decision to support the aspirations of the Jewish people, of the Jewish Zionists. In 1917, it was right in the middle of the First World War. And as I said earlier, it wasn't just Balfour, it was the entire war cabinet that decided that what had been advocated by people like Herzl should be supported by the British. And at that time, let's not forget, this was the British Empire, the very powerful British Empire that was giving its support to the Zionist aspirations. However, the British did not control physically, did not have control or did not occupy all of Palestine in those days, and they did not have title. So what is important is to understand that the Balfour Declaration was like an egg that had to be fertilized. By itself, it could not be the source of the rights and obligations that I'm referring to. Very significant politically, but not enough. Again, I was mentioning that Herzl wrestled with which solution could he support to help the Jewish people worldwide. You know, for so long, the Jewish people tried to be part of different societies, and no matter where they were expelled, they were murdered. You know, there was no acceptance of the Jewish people in so many of the European states. We know what happened in Russia and even in Spain and in Portugal. And so he decided the solution is for us to have our own state. And that's what he presented during the Basel Conference of 1897, attended by 200 or so Jews who supported his vision, supported his solution. Can you imagine 200 Jews coming together and agreeing that they would pursue a particular solution? That's not happening too often. Sadly, I must say that today, the lack of unity among the Jewish people in different parts of the world, the lack of unity among the Jewish people in Israel is harmful. My hope is that at the very least, I can present these legal arguments, these facts, and there can be agreement because, as I said, They're irrefutable. So here's the area that the Balfour Declaration was referring to in 1917. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. They were subdivided in provinces. It was not known as Palestine. Palestine was, for many in Britain, biblical lands, the lands that are described in the Hebrew Bible, that are described in the New Testament of the Christian faith. So the Paris Peace Conference is the next very significant historical event, because it's in Paris that the victorious nations gathered for 6 months, the first 6 months of 1919, to make decisions with regard to reparations, with regard to what territories would be lost by the defeated nations. Very important conference from the perspective of the Jewish people. I'm going to explain why. The Supreme Council of the Allied Powers is one of these very fundamental aspects of my argument, because it's not all the victorious nations that ended up with the power of disposition in respect to certain territories. It was 5 nations. It was the US, UK, it was France, Italy, and Japan. That's why I ended up going to Japan, spoke in the Japanese parliament and reminded them of the important role that they played. I'll come back to that. And during the conference, 2 parties, I stress this, not a multiplicity of parties, 2 main parties made presentations as to the status of the areas in the Middle East that were going to be taken away from the Turks. And they were the Arabs, led by Faisal, who made his presentation on February the 6th, 1919, and the Zionist delegation led by Weizmann, presentation on February 27th. Now, even if you're not a lawyer, you'll understand that when there's a court proceeding, what a very crucial moment in the proceeding is when the lawyers present the case of their clients, the audience, the court hearing. And in regard to Palestine, in regard to other areas of the Middle East, that was February 6th for the Arabs, February 27 for the Jews. This date should be known. The minutes of what happened during that presentation should be memorized by the Jewish people because it was so important. The Arabs, before these presentations in January, had already made certain commitments in agreements with the Jewish people. In fact, Faisal and Weizmann entered into agreement in January of 1919, January 3. In that agreement, they pledged to support each other's claims. There's a distinction made by the Arab state they want to create, a large state they want to create, and Palestine. And if you look at the agreement, it incorporates the words of the Balfour Declaration. Palestine was for the Jews, and the Arabs knew that. They accepted that. So on February the 6th, in front of the 5 nations I mentioned, the presentation is made by the Arabs. These are so significant facts, historical facts. The presentation is made, and during the presentation, the Arabs ask for recognition that there are people in international law. They ask for independence of their people wherever Arabs had significant populations in the Ottoman territories. And they stress, as far as Palestine is concerned, they leave it to the side. Remember, in January, there was an agreement between Faisal and Weizmann. Can you imagine that this should not be overlooked? The Arabs, the true litigants, the parties, made these pledges. And then February 27, the delegation representing the Jewish people, in front of those 5 nations, and you'll see why it's so important, present their case. They're asking for recognition of the historic title of the Jewish people and Palestine. And the right, note this, the right to reconstitute what they used to have. Can you imagine? If anybody with power of disposition said yes to this, you'd have to look at what the Jewish people used to have in every component of the Holy Land, in Judea and Samaria, in Jerusalem. They'd have the right to point out what they had and to reconstitute it. They present a map, which I'll show you, of what Palestine should comprise. And they ask for a delay. They don't want instant sovereignty and independence. Because at the time, maybe there were 250,000 Jews in that area, and maybe 700,000 Arabs. So they wanted time to bring Jews from around the world who were desperate to go somewhere away from the persecution of the nations where they were. They asked for time. So they asked for a trust to be set up to give them time to immigrate and to bring Jews from around the world. And interestingly, if that right was granted, that would mean that the Jews around the world were given rights, not Jews, only the Jews that resided in Palestine. So here's the map that was presented at the Paris Peace Conference. And you'll note that almost everything which is biblically significant, when you think of how Moses allotted some lands to certain tribes on the east side of the Jordan River, the key components of that were included. And of course, the other tribes had entitlements on the west side of what is known then as Palestine. Now, next significant event, the Covenant of the League of Nations. In Paris, these 5 nations I've referred to made some very crucial decisions. Led by President Wilson, they decided that the war, the First World War, had been so devastating. The cost, human lives, the financial cost were so enormous that they had to find a way to change the circumstances, to change the structures in the world. And that's how they came up with the idea of setting up an international organization known as the League of Nations. Why is the Covenant of the League of Nations relevant in my analysis? Here's just a little background. The purposes of the covenant. When it was adopted, it was included in the Treaty of Sèvres of June 28, 1919. It became an international treaty. And international law, treaties are sources of rights and obligations. Some of those rights belong to the Jewish people. In Article 22 of the covenant, something absolutely unique was done. The establishment of a system called a mandate system, a trust system, whereby the winning victorious nations, instead of just taking over the areas that they had conquered, decided to set them aside and in effect convey the rights to the people of those areas under supervision. It wouldn't be an instant conveyance, but it would be under a trust, under a mandate. And then when they were ready to take over, they would. These were called sacred trusts. And as far as Palestine was concerned, I'm going to show you that the beneficiaries of that trust were the Jewish people. Article 119 of the Treaty of Versailles is an example of what I will be emphasizing, Rabbi, over and over again. Look at the powers of these nations. These 5 nations are the ones who received rights and titles to the German territories that are taken away from Germany. They become the title holders. Did that happen in respect to Palestine? Here's another example. 5 nations get title to other territories. In the article that's in front of you, it's made clear that the losers here, Austro-Hungarian powers, convey title to certain territories to the 5 powers. Now the San Remo Conference. a defining moment in history. And my plea around the world is not only for the nations to recognize the significance of that conference, but for the Jewish people to be aware of the fact that there were beneficiaries legally of the decisions made during that conference. The villa where it took place in 1919, the conference was in 1920, and the villa today, many times, was supposed to be there in April of this year for the conference that I organized, which sadly had to be canceled. In this villa, the five powers reconvene. They were there for a week, and for 2 days, they focused on what was presented in Paris by the Arabs, on what was presented in Paris by the Jewish delegation, by the Zionist delegation. In other words, it was like judges on a court of appeal. They've heard the presentations, they've heard the parties, and now they go into a chamber and deliberate. Here they are. I was, in fact, amazingly able to lease or to rent for a number of days a room in the villa, which happened to be the very room where they met. I had to figure out who the leaders were. That's the Supreme Council. And the host was Italy. Nitti was the prime minister. Lord George played a very crucial role, the Prime Minister of England. And there were others. Mitterrand was the Prime Minister of France, and he was there. So here they are, standing in front of the villa in April of 1920, after they've made decisions which changed everything. You will see that what comes out of St. Remo are a number of treaties which reflect the decisions made by these leaders in April of 1920. That is why it's so important. And here's the key resolution, April 25. We were going to be there 100 years later, April 25 of 2020. And in that meeting, during those deliberations, the result is that they adopted the policies of the Balfour Declaration. Remember I mentioned that the Balfour Declaration was like an egg that had to be fertilized? Well, they did the fertilization necessary to transform it into a principle of international law. It happened there. And during that conference, I have the minutes, which are included in the thesis. I don't know, Rabbi, if you had a chance to look at the minutes, but Lord Curzon was very, very, he was the Secretary of State of the British Empire, very influential, and he makes it clear that Palestine is to be the future home of national home of the Jews throughout the world. Now, legally, this is an absolutely radical decision because it means that those entitled to settle in what was Palestine are not just the Jews that are there, but they're the Jews worldwide. All the Jews of the world, maybe 14, 15 million Jews alive then, become, in effect, virtual inhabitants of that territory. And during that meeting, you should be asking the question, well, when we talked about Palestine, what did they mean? What was supposed to be included in Palestine? What were the boundaries supposed to be? And that's where Lord George, when he was asked by the French leader for some ideas in that regard, his answer was, it should be the territory from Dan to Beersheba. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Lord George, a Christian, was a lover of scripture, and he spent a lot of time reading scripture. So he understood the meaning of Dan to Beersheba. The French guy didn't. So the discussion went on, and that's when Lord George said, well, I'll tell you what it is that we should give the Jewish people in response to their claims. And he pulled out a map, and it was a map from a particular book, if you want to get that book, from Reverend George Adams Smith. And I happen to have an original copy of that book. Map 34, here's the title page of the book. And it's from 1915. And map 34, which is the one presented by Lord George, shows the kingdom of David and Solomon. And I'm sure that many of those who are viewing this presentation right now, I've seen dozens, if not hundreds of maps before. This one is so relevant because that was the basis of the determination of the territory that was considered linked to the Jews historically. Imagine this. So this is a relevant map from the point of view of international law from my perspective. And here's an original of the book, which I have here. And just so you know, this is show and tell time, that this map does exist. This is an original. And here's the map that is on your screen in this original book. And just so you know that we're talking about the same book, here's the title page. Okay, this is a sacred document from my perspective, because that's what the powers agreed to give to the Jews. And in that book, for instance, there's a beautiful map of what is referred to as modern Jerusalem. When you think of Jerusalem, that was Jerusalem until the end of the 19th century. It was basically the old city. And today, when the nations want to carve up Jerusalem on the basis of the Green Line, which was a mere armistice line, they don't realize that if they did that, the entirety of the old city would become part of the Palestinian capital and would be taken away from the Jerusalem of Israel. Absurd. They don't realize that the old city is the essence of Jerusalem and has been for centuries. Why did I focus on the old city in my thesis? Because I realized that it was the most sought after, it was the ultimate bone of contention. Now, I stress the importance of San Remo. And of course, I think it's a pivotal, it's a defining moment. But if you think I'm exaggerating, Wiseman was there. Look what he had to say. In this statement, he says it's no exaggeration that it's the most important moment in the history of the Jewish people since the exile. I think he agreed with me that it was an important moment. Now, following the San Remo Conference, a Treaty of Sèvres here is that it codifies, it incorporates what was decided during the San Remo Conference. So if you look at the Treaty of Sèvres, you will note that the decisions that were made, the resolution of San Remo is there. But note 132, Article 132, Turkey renounces title in favor of the 5 nations we've been talking about. They now have title that they can give to the Arabs, that they can give to the Jews. And later, the French and the British worked on the details of the boundaries. I won't get into that. And then we get to the mandate for Palestine. Look at Article 132 of the mandate. It says precisely that Turkey has renounced in favor of the principal allied powers all rights entitled to Palestine. And then in the preamble, it goes on to explain that here's that clause that is so important at the start of that. And here's the document that comes out of all this. This is the Magna Carta of the Jewish people, the mandate for Palestine, which is, in my view, to the extent that there's been no final determination in respect to any part of what was Palestine then, it's still relevant. Article 2 basically takes the principle of the Balfour Declaration. That's what was decided in San Remo. And as far as Palestine is concerned, the purpose of the mandate is to establish a national home for the Jewish people. as laid down in the preamble. And the preamble, look at this, recognizes the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine. And remember what we talked about before? The right to reconstitute what they used to have. So what's happening in the world today is that the nations are acting as if this never took place. If those who had the right to give title and gave it to the Jewish people under this mandate never did. If you look at the other mandates that came out of the San Remo conference, the one for Syria and Lebanon, and the one for Mesopotamia, and compare it to the mandate for Palestine, those other two were for the inhabitants, the Arab inhabitants of those territories. But the one in respect to Palestine was for the Jewish people, the national home of the Jewish people. So that's what came out of all of this. Palestine, the blue, was supposed to comprise territory on both sides of the Jordan River. Article 25, don't have time to go into details, was amended by the British to give them the right to partition Palestine under pressure because of the conflict between the French and the Hashemites. They had kicked out Faisal from Damascus, and they wanted to placate the Hashemites, and they ended up introducing this article, in my view, illegally, but eventually supported by the League of Nations. But whatever they did in Transjordan, they had to honor Articles 15, 16, and 18 there. The old Article 25 didn't have anything to do with the partition of Palestine. Anyway, September 16, 1922, the British present this memo and pledge, that's what's in red here, to continue to protect the rights of the Jewish people in Transjordan, which they never did. Nobody raised a finger. Nobody said anything about those transgressions. Here are the rights that were disregarded, 15, 16. And as a result of this, what happens? Look at this map of the of the League of Nations, which specifies that a state for the Arabs is created within Palestine. So right now, when you have the conflict between the Palestinians and the Jews, you have another conflict between Arabs and Jews, because they conveniently transform the Arab party to the conflict into Palestinians, which of course is a name that covered all the inhabitants of Palestine during the mandate, Jews, non-Jews, Arabs, but now they're the Palestinians. And it's important to be Palestinians, because that way you forget the fact that the Arabs were given 2/3 of Palestine, 2/3. And look at this. This is a League of Nations map. There is an Arab state now in Palestine. It's called Jordan. Here's what happens. Treaty of Lausanne, 1923, was very significant because of the Treaty of Sèvres was signed but not ratified by the Turks. This treaty confirmed everything that was given before. No time to go into the white paper of 1939, an abominable act of the British government, which contravened all of the rights of the Jewish people under the mandate. UN Charter, I want to stress that this charter, which is an international treaty, came about after the dissolution of the League of Nations. But in a final resolution, the League said, you've got to continue to look after the well-being and development of the people concerned by the mandates. And for Palestine, that was the Jews. So that's the obligation of the UN, to take care of those covered by that. And Article 80 of the UN Charter specifies that there's nothing in the UN Charter that should be construed to take away the rights of those who were given rights before the Charter. Partition resolution was a UN act, General Assembly, not binding, a mere recommendation. It never happened. And so what I want to do is, the birth of the State of Israel, of course, was relevant because there was an assertion of rights in respect to territories as a result. And the declaration made reference to the Balfour Declaration, made reference to the mandate for Palestine. Sadly, did not mention the San Remo Conference. I should have been an advisor to Ben Gurion in those days. I mentioned the Armistice Agreement. It was in no way to affect the rights and claims and positions of the parties in respect to sovereignty in respect to territorial entitlement. How is it? What kind of attitude is causing the nations today to treat the Green Line as if it was sacred, as if it was a source of rights and obligations? It was never meant to be. It was an armistice line under the law of war, merely to get the parties to stop fighting. And I think the possession of 1967, when Israel, after the war of 1967, was very relevant because, of course, Israel ended up taking possession of what is referred to as the West Bank, the disputed territories. Very interesting, Rabbi, when you think of possession, because I had to become a sort of a, not an expert, but I had to spend a lot of time studying scriptures in the Hebrew Bible, in the Christian New Testament, in the Quran, to find out what were the foundations of the claims. And it was exasperating to try to summarize the links between the Holy Land and the Jewish people, because there was no end to it. I had to create one executive summary after another because the connections are so numerous and so deep. So 1967, Israel possesses, does not assert sovereignty over all of it, but they do assert sovereignty over Jerusalem. The UN, which was so silent while the Jordanians occupied and then annexed the so-called West Bank, all of a sudden they wake up. And every 2 weeks, there's a new resolution condemning Israel. As a human rights advocate, I'm astonished by the extent to which they ignored the atrocities, they ignored the actions of the Jordanians in the old city when they demolished synagogues, when they did horrible things to the Jewish people who were left behind. And here, all of a sudden, because Israel is asserting some rights in respect to the territories that it is now possessing, now they act up. Okay, 1980, the capital of Israel is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is annexed. It completes what was necessary in international law. And in my opinion, if Israel annexed other parts of the disputed territories, they would be merely redeeming and appropriating what was given by the Supreme Council and under the mandate for Palestine. Rabbi, I think I'll stop here in case we want to have a few questions.
Okay, there's so much to discuss. You really ran through so much of this so quickly, and it's impossible to unpack it all carefully. But your thesis is that the San Remo Conference was really the pivotal moment in granting sovereignty to the Jewish people. Why is it that when the State of Israel was founded, the San Remo Conference was not referenced?
I think, again, I'm not an historian, but you have to study history when you deal with these issues. And you have to understand that on May 14 of 1948, when Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence, that was the day, the very day, the British abandoned the Jews. They left Palestine. The same British who were arming the Arabs, the same British who helped the legion from Jordan to become as strong as it became, the same British who prevented the Jews from obtaining armament, from having anything to defend themselves. So this was a hastily arranged meeting for the declaration, and I'm sure that he had help from a number of councils, but it was, you have to look at the context. The war, which began almost the next day or the day after, it didn't just happen. It was in the offing. It was everybody knew that the Arabs were preparing to do something like that. So in my view, you have to understand the circumstances of the day and the pressures There was not the luxury of turning to a number of legal counsels to draft a comprehensive resolution.
I understand. By the way, if anyone has any questions, you're more than welcome to type them in the chat. What I wanted to ask you, or perhaps even offer a suggestion, probably the most effective way of influencing the international community would be through working through our children. You know, the Palestinians for decades and for generations have been corrupting the mind of their children by portraying the Israel and Israelis in the worst possible way. And one of the things that all of us fear is that not only are Jewish children not studying this carefully, not studying the history of the founding of the State of Israel, which is why so many of our Jewish youth in the diaspora have become disaffected and disinterested in the State of Israel and have sort of bought into a more pervasive message that Israel is an occupier and the Palestinians are the underdog and the persecuted class. But what if there was a curriculum that could be underwritten and accepted by different educational bodies throughout the world to adopt this kind of narrative and pass it on to the children of the world, especially to our own children. I just find it lamentable that our children and the entire world is not being educated in this way. What I know this is not your area, but what do you think can be done to really proliferate this message more, especially to the youth of the world today?
Okay, well, I continue to believe that because what I presented is irrefutable and true, there were so many opportunities. I presented this at Columbia University with hundreds of people there. No one stood up and refuted any aspect of what I presented. So it's not too late. It's time, I believe. This is the right time to work on such different programs, educate young children, educate high school students, and not only in North America, but throughout the world. But it took a while, Rabbi, for many to hear these presentations. And I can tell you that there are individuals all over Europe, all over North America, and different parts of the world who are willing to be supportive of such initiatives to educate the Jewish people. But you'll understand.
What would you recommend to the people from our congregation here in Toronto who are listening to this very brief presentation and who would like to be better spokespersons to the world about Israel's international legal right to sovereignty over the entire land? How would you recommend that we go about this? Do we take to social media? Do we stand on a soapbox and use a megaphone? What are we supposed to do?
It begins with, first of all, those who are willing to be part of the solution of there's a shortcoming. No one is systematically presenting these truths where they should be presented. They must become knowledgeable. It's important for each individual to make sure that they have an understanding of the basic facts which are presented so that they can turn around during whether it's in a synagogue or another setting and explain the basics to others. It begins with each one becoming more aware, not of every component of the thesis that we've talked about, but what I did in 30 minutes. I really needed an hour, and you saw that because there's so much. But can you imagine? I've managed to squeeze 1,300 pages into a chart with the basic components. So
let me
it's
ask
not
you
impossible.
this. For someone who doesn't have the gumption to read this thesis, this 1,300-page thesis, what can you recommend? Is there something online or a book that is a summary of this legal argument that you can recommend that people can have access to?
Okay. Rabbi, what I will do is share with you, and then you can share with anyone that is looking for this kind of background information. I've made presentations. Some are 15 minutes, some are half an hour, some are 1 hour, some are 5 minutes. I'll send you the links. And I think the starting point is to view a few of those so that the information sinks in a little bit. And I often will take a different approach during a lecture, during a presentation. And I've done many presentations around the world, and many are online. So if you simply Google Jacques Gauthier, Jerusalem, Jacques Gauthier, Jerusalem, you will find dozens of presentations. And if you're serious, if you're interested in changing this really lamentable situation that you've referred to, then you please tune in to these truths, because the Jewish people are not only the recipient of promises from the Almighty respecting to the Holy Land. They are the beneficiaries of commitments, pledges in international law. And no Jewish person should ever feel like he doesn't have, or she does not have the right to be anywhere.
Right. And so just some of the comments from the people who have been watching your presentation, it seems almost like we've gone about it backwards. As one person asks, should we not be fighting the land grabs by the Arabs and the EU with the information you have presented? And another person asks, are there any Jewish educators with knowledge of curriculum development who can synthesize this information into a history course to be taught in Jewish schools? We're not obviously expecting you to answer this question, Dr. Gauthier, but that's a wonderful idea. And it's lamentable that I don't believe that it is part of a lot of schools' curriculum.
Yeah. But what has happened, Rabbi, over the years is that as I've made presentations, certain individuals have realized the importance of education. And I think of a young man, or relatively young man in Toronto by the name of Richard Bass, who heard one of my presentations and was fascinated. Next thing you know, he spent months and months and months. He's a school teacher, preparing materials for schools. And his work has been used by certain schools, not only in Canada, but in the United States. So it was one person who just undertook to be part of the solution, to do something about the lack of knowledge, and it made a difference.
And of course, someone commented also about the perennial issue of anti-Semitism, which states that no matter how convincing and logical the argument is, if someone wishes to hate, they won't necessarily listen to reason. And that's something also that perhaps has to be fought. And as much as you are convinced that truth eventually prevails, the question philosophically that we could ask is, but how much blood needs to be spilled before that light finally comes to the fore?
Yes. I have a plea regarding the significance of the arguments I've presented. I'm reminded of the scriptures where the walls of Jerusalem were down. And you could help me with how to say this in Hebrew, but Nehemiah, the governor, who came to try to deal with the broken walls, tried to unite the Jews who were there. And in 52 days, I believe, he rebuilt the walls. Right now, the legal walls around not only Jerusalem, but the land of Israel are broken. From a legal perspective, no one is saying or doing enough to protect the rights of the Jewish people. The danger is this: if the Jews do not have the rights under international law to be in any part of Jerusalem or any part of Judea and Samaria, the disputed territories, well, in that event, in that case, they don't have the right to be in the territories that are controlled by the state of Israel, the land of Israel. If you didn't get the rights in San Remo under the mandate for Palestine, then again, you perhaps have stolen land that belonged to somebody else. When the nations speak of occupied Palestinian lands, there's no foundation for that. these are occupied to the extent that they haven't been annexed Jewish territories. So the danger, my plea is that if you don't defend, if you don't rebuild the legal walls, what's going to be at stake is what I'm reading about now almost daily. The one state proposal.
Yeah.
The one state with a majority of Arabs
Yes.
and Jews in a minority under the control of the Palestinian Arabs.
Well,
all the land.
And your presentation tonight only confirms why all of us in the Jewish community and beyond must remain vigilant and know how to work through the political process and to make our voices heard. Dr. Jaques Gauthier, you truly are a crusader and a hero for the state of Israel and for our people. I want to thank you for not only this presentation tonight, but in a much broader sense for all of the work that you have done and that you will continue to do, and that for all of the voices that you have also engendered and allowed to grow. Remember, everyone who's watching, Google Jaques Gauthier, Jerusalem, to be able to follow even more of Dr. Gauthier's videos and presentations, and you'll be able to find his charts. I want to thank you again. Again, thank you to your daughter for doing the technical work from your end. I want to thank everyone online now for watching, and I wish you all a good night and a good week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was a privilege.
Thank you. Bye.